The wind was a blade, honed on the vast, unforgiving anvil of the plains. It screamed across the frozen earth, shearing away the last vestiges of warmth and hope. Alara Vance huddled deeper into her threadbare wool coat, the fabric a pathetic shield against the onslaught. Each gust felt personal, a malevolent shove intent on scouring her from the face of the world. The sky, a bruised and churning slate gray, promised only more of the same, pressing down with a suffocating weight that mirrored the despair in her own chest. Her wagon lay defeated in the rutted track, one wheel shattered, its spokes jutting out like the ribs of a starved animal. The old mare, bless her loyal heart, stood with her head bowed, her coat rimed with ice, her breath pluming in ragged, exhausted clouds. They were done, both of them. It had been 3 days since she'd seen another soul. 3 days of this relentless, early winter that had descended like a judgment. When Jedediah had cast her out, his face a mask of smug piety, he had given her the broken-down wagon and the old mare as a gesture of his supposed Christian charity. "Go find your own way, Aunt Alara," he'd said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Surely the Lord will provide for the righteous." The words had been poison, a final twist of the knife after he and his simpering wife had seized the small farm she and Thomas had built over 40 years, producing a will of dubious origin that left them everything. The law, as it so often did, had sided with the men who spoke the loudest and had the most ink on their papers. Now, the Lord's provision felt like this wind, this cold, this utter abandonment. Alara's hands, tucked into her armpits for a sliver of warmth, were numb and useless. Her feet were stones. She could feel the cold seeping past the layers of her clothing, past her skin, working its way into her bones, a slow, creeping death. This, she thought with a strange, detached clarity, is how it ends. Not in a warm bed surrounded by loving faces, as she had always imagined with Thomas, but here, on a forsaken track, frozen into an anonymous sculpture of failure and grief. The memory of Thomas's warm hand in hers was a distant, fading ember, and the thought of it brought a fresh wave of pain so sharp it was physical. He had been her shelter. Without him, she was just adrift in the storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, the wind lashing icy tears across her cheeks. Despair was a heavy cloak, and it would be so easy to simply lie down beside the broken wagon, to let the snow drift over her and sleep. It was a tempting thought, a siren song of release from the pain and the cold and the gnawing hunger in her belly. But some stubborn, infuriating flicker of life refused to be extinguished. It was the same grit that had seen her through droughts and sickness and the loss of their first child, a tiny, perfect girl who had lived only a day. It was the part of her that Thomas had always called her bedrock. "You're stronger than you know, Alara," he would say, his voice a low rumble against her ear. The memory was a goad. She would not dishonor his faith in her by dying like a stray dog in a ditch. Straightening her spine, a painful, cracking process, she forced her eyes open and scanned the horizon. There was nothing, only the endless, rolling expanse of dun-colored prairie, already turning white as the snow began to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that clung to her eyelashes and melted on her face. It was a world bleached of all color and life. She was about to turn away, to admit defeat, when she saw it. A trick of the eye, perhaps, a phantom conjured by a freezing, desperate mind. A light. It was impossibly faint, a pinprick of dull yellow against the oppressive gray. So far in the distance it seemed to waver and vanish with every blink. But it was there. A single, solitary light in the vast, gathering darkness. Hope, she discovered, was a painful, brutal thing. It demanded action. It demanded she move her frozen limbs, that she leave the pathetic shelter of the wagon and the company of her weary mare, and walk toward that fragile promise. She whispered a prayer of apology to the horse, stroking the animal's icy neck. Then, taking a deep breath that burned in her lungs, she set one foot in front of the other. The first few steps were agony. Her muscles screamed, her joints protested. The wind fought her, pushing her back, trying to trip her, to throw her down into the snow that was now beginning to accumulate. She kept her eyes fixed on the light, making it her entire world. It was a lodestar, the only point of certainty in a universe that had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and white. She did not know if she had the strength to reach it. She did not know what she would find if she did. But she knew, with the finality of a death sentence or a divine promise, that she had to try. The world narrowed to the crunch of her worn boots in the snow, the howl of the wind in her ears, and the tiny, distant flame that was either her salvation or her final, cruel illusion. The walk was a pilgrimage through a frozen hell. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the burning of her lungs and the screaming protest of her muscles. The light would disappear behind a swell of the land, and a fresh wave of terror would wash over her, a cold more profound than the wind. Had she imagined it? Was she walking in circles, a fool chasing a ghost on the prairie? Then it would reappear, a little closer, a little brighter, and the agonizing spark of hope would reignite, forcing her onward. She fell twice, her body a dead weight against the accumulating snow. The second time, she lay there for a long moment, the cold seeping into her back, the temptation to simply close her eyes overwhelming. The image of Thomas's face, etched with worry, swam in her mind. "Get up, Elara." His voice, so clear. She pushed herself up with a groan, her hands raw, her will a single, raw nerve. Finally, the pinprick of light resolved itself into the square of a window, a warm, golden rectangle cut out of the deepening twilight. It belonged to a small, dark shape hunkered low against the land, a cabin, with a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a defiant banner against the storm. A sod-roofed barn stood nearby, a testament to practicality and endurance. A fence, stark and dark against the snow, enclosed the small homestead. It was a pocket of order in a world of chaos. Relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees, warred with a new anxiety. Who lived here? A family? A lone trapper? Someone who would turn a desperate woman away, or someone who would show mercy? She had nothing to offer, nothing to trade. She was a beggar, her only currency the story of her own misfortune, a currency too often devalued in a hard land. She reached the wooden gate, her fingers too numb to work the simple latch. She fumbled with it, a pathetic, clumsy struggle, until it finally gave way. Each step up the short path to the cabin door was a monumental effort. The warmth emanating from the structure was a tangible thing, a promise that made the cold still clinging to her seem all the more vicious. She stood on the porch, a single plank of wood raised above the snow, and hesitated. Her reflection, caught for a second in the window's glass, was a stranger, a wild-eyed, snow-caked wraith with hair plastered to her skull. Who would open their door to such a creature? But the alternative was to turn back, to collapse in the snow and let the storm have her. She raised a trembling, frozen fist and knocked. The sound was feeble, absorbed by the wood and the howling wind. She knocked again, harder this time, putting the last of her strength into it. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a scraping sound from within, the shifting of a bolt. The door swung inward, opening a sliver. A man stood there, silhouetted against the warm light of the cabin. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his form filling the doorway. He said nothing, simply looked at her. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and assessing. He was not old, nor was he young. Perhaps 40, she guessed, his face weathered by the same sun and wind that had worn down the land itself. There was a stillness about him, a quiet solidity. He held a rifle in the crook of one arm, held loosely but ready. Alara's prepared words, the carefully constructed plea for help, vanished from her mind. All that was left was the raw, unvarnished truth of her situation. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy, cracked thing, almost lost in the wind. "Please," she whispered, the single word a prayer. Her gaze met his, and in the dim light she saw his eyes. They were clear and gray as a winter sky, and held no malice, only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. My wagon is broken. The storm," she gestured vaguely back into the howling darkness. "Grant me shelter. Just for tonight." It was an old-fashioned, formal plea, the words of a different time, but they were the only ones that felt right. He did not answer immediately. His eyes moved over her, taking in the ice in her hair, the chattering of her teeth, the desperation etched into every line of her face. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, not pity, but a kind of recognition. He seemed to be looking not at a stranger, but at a familiar condition, a creature at the mercy of the elements. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back from the door, pulling it wider. It was not a warm invitation, but a simple, practical concession. An opening. He moved the rifle, setting it against the wall just inside the door, a gesture of trust so profound in this empty land that it made her want to weep. "Come in," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if unused to speaking. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her like a blanket. It was a living thing, a presence that thawed the ice in her veins and made her head swim. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and drying wool. For a moment, the world tilted, the floorboards seeming to rush up to meet her. A strong hand gripped her arm, steadying her. It was his. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her system, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling. He guided her toward a simple wooden chair near the stone fireplace, where a healthy fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows across the room. She sank into it, her body surrendering to exhaustion, every muscle, every bone, aching with a profound weariness. She looked around the room as feeling slowly, painfully, returned to her extremities. It was a single, large space, meticulously clean and ordered. A bed, neatly made with a thick quilt, was tucked into one corner. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins, sacks of flour, and a small, neat collection of books. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived alone and found comfort in routine and control. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the window, no decorative fripperies, but it was not a cheerless space. It was solid, self-contained, and safe. The man moved with a quiet economy of motion. He stoked the fire, adding another log, then went to the stove and poured coffee from a blue enamel pot into a tin mug. He brought it to her, his large, calloused hand holding it out. She took it with both of hers, her fingers clumsy and stiff. The heat of the mug was a miracle. She brought it to her lips, the bitter, scalding liquid a shock to her system. It burned a trail down to her stomach, chasing away the deep, internal cold. He watched her for a moment, his gray eyes unreadable, then turned and ladled a thick stew from a pot on the stove into a bowl. He placed it on the table, along with a hunk of dark bread. He did not invite her to eat. He simply provided. Alara rose from the chair, her legs unsteady, and moved to the table. She sat down and picked up the spoon. The first mouthful of stew, rich with venison and root vegetables, was an explosion of flavor and warmth. She ate slowly at first, then with a growing, ravenous hunger she was too tired to be ashamed of. She had not realized how empty she was. The man sat in the other chair, not eating, but cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with practiced, efficient skill. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the scrape of her spoon against the bowl. The silence was not awkward. It was peaceful, a respite. In this small, warm cabin, with this silent, capable stranger, the world and its cruelty felt 1,000 miles away. When she had finished, scraping the last of the stew from the bowl, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. He glanced up from his work, met her eyes for a brief second, and gave that same short, economical nod. No words were needed. In the shared warmth of his fire, a silent contract had been forged. For tonight, at least, she was safe. The next morning, Alara awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and a profound, muffled silence had fallen over the landscape. She was lying on a pallet of blankets near the fireplace, the embers still glowing with a dull red warmth. For a long moment, she didn't know where she was. The memory of the storm, the broken wagon, the desperate walk through the snow, returned in a confusing jumble. Then she saw the sturdy lines of the cabin, the neat shelves, the sleeping form of the man in the bed across the room, and it all came back. He had given her his place by the fire. A wave of gratitude, so intense it felt like a physical ache, washed over her. She had expected to be sent on her way at first light, but the world outside was buried. She slipped out from under the heavy wool blankets, her movements stiff and quiet. The floorboards were cold beneath her stockinged feet. Peering out the single window, she saw a landscape of impossible, pristine white. The snow had drifted high against the cabin and the barn, smoothing all the hard edges of the world into soft, gentle curves. The sky was a pale, luminous gray. Nothing moved. It was beautiful and intimidating. There would be no travel today, or tomorrow, or perhaps for many days to come. The thought, which should have filled her with panic, instead brought a strange sense of calm. For now, there were no decisions to make, no roads to travel. There was only this place. The man, her rescuer, was still asleep. In repose, his face was less guarded. The harsh lines etched by sun and solitude were softened. She could see the dark stubble on his jaw, the way his thick, dark hair fell across his forehead. There was a youthfulness to him that his waking severity concealed. He looked not innocent, precisely, but untouched by the particular kind of corrosion that came from dealing with other people's greed and deceit. He lived by the rhythms of the land, not the whims of men. She wondered about him, this silent man. Silas. He had told her his name last night in a single, clipped word when she had asked. Silas Croft. He had offered no other information, and she had not pressed. Not wanting to wake him, she moved about the small cabin with practiced quiet. She saw the water bucket was low and, pulling on her still damp boots and her coat, she slipped outside. The cold was immediate and sharp, but clean. The air was so still it felt solid. She found the well, the handle of the pump crusted with ice, and worked it until fresh, clear water gushed forth. Carrying the heavy bucket back inside, she felt a sense of purpose for the first time in weeks. It was a small thing, a simple chore, but it was a contribution. She was not merely a supplicant. She rekindled the fire, adding kindling and a log from the neat stack beside the hearth, her movements sure and familiar. Soon, a cheerful blaze was roaring, chasing the morning chill from the room. She found the coffee tin and the pot, and set it on the stove to boil. The familiar, comforting aroma began to fill the cabin. It was in these small domestic rituals that she had always found her footing. They were the anchors of a life, the quiet repetitions that held the chaos at bay. By the time Silas stirred, the coffee was ready and the cabin was warm. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, his movements slow and deliberate. His gray eyes found her by the stove, and for a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. She braced herself, expecting him to ask what she was doing, to tell her she was taking liberties. But he said nothing. He swung his legs out of bed, pulled on his trousers and a heavy wool shirt, and stomped his feet into his boots. He went to the basin in the corner and splashed icy water on his face, hissing through his teeth. Then he walked to the stove, took the mug she had set out for him, and filled it with coffee. He took a long drink, his back to her. "The drifts are high," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. It wasn't a question or a statement of concern. It was a fact, like the sky being gray or the fire being hot. "The mare?" Alara asked, her voice quiet. "She'll need tending. I'll see to her," he replied. He pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat and a hat, took his rifle from its place by the door, and went out without another word. Alara watched him go, his broad shoulders pushing through the deep snow towards the barn. He hadn't told her to leave. He hadn't told her to stay. He had simply accepted her presence as another fact of this new, snowbound world. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was in a strange sort of limbo, a guest with no departure date. The feeling of dependency was galling to her pride, but the sense of safety was a balm to her frayed soul. She would not be a burden. She would earn her keep, for as long as he allowed her to stay. She set about exploring the small larder. He was well stocked for winter, sacks of flour, beans, potatoes, and onions in a small root cellar beneath a trapdoor. There was salted pork and venison jerky hanging from the rafters. It was the larder of a man who knew how to provide for himself, who relied on no one. Using what she found, she began to prepare breakfast. She mixed a batter for pancakes, found a small jar of molasses, and sliced some of the salt pork to fry. The work was a comfort. The familiar weight of the skillet, the sizzle of the pork, the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into a nourishing meal. It was a language she understood. It was how she had always shown her love for Thomas, how she had made their small house a home. Here, it was a way of speaking without words, of offering thanks and demonstrating her worth. When Silas returned, his cheeks red from the cold, the smell of frying pork and warm pancakes greeted him. A stack of golden brown cakes sat on a plate on the table. He stopped in the doorway, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm, dictated by the needs of the land and the constraints of the snow. The world outside remained a vast, silent expanse of white, the roads impassable, their isolation complete. Each morning, Silas would rise before dawn and head out to the barn to tend to his livestock. A few hardy cattle, his own horse, and now, Alara's old mare, who he had rescued and brought into the warmth and safety of the barn. Alara would wake soon after, rekindle the fire, and prepare breakfast. They ate their meals together at the small wooden table, mostly in silence. The silence was no longer a void, but a shared space, a comfortable quiet that did not demand to be filled. Alara learned the man through his routines. He was methodical, patient, and deeply connected to his animals and his land. He never wasted emotion or a resource. Every tool had its place, every task its proper time. He moved with a kind of settled purpose that she, who had been so violently uprooted, found deeply calming to watch. In the evenings, after the final chores were done, he would sit by the fire and read from his small collection of books, histories, almanacs, and books on animal husbandry, or he would meticulously mend a piece of harness, his large, capable hands surprisingly deft. He rarely spoke of himself, and Alara did not ask. She sensed that his solitude was a deliberate choice, a fortress he had built around himself for reasons she could not guess. In turn, she made the cabin her domain. She had found a purpose, a way to repay his taciturn kindness. She cooked and cleaned, her presence softening the hard edges of his bachelor existence. She discovered a small sack of dried apples and made a pie, the sweet smell of cinnamon and baking fruit filling the small space, a scent so incongruous in this stark, masculine world that it felt like an act of gentle rebellion. When Silas came in from the cold and smelled it, he stopped, his head tilted, as if trying to place a long-forgotten memory. He ate a slice that evening without comment, but when he was finished, he pushed the plate away with a sigh of satisfaction that was more eloquent than any compliment. She mended his clothes, her needle flashing in the firelight, reinforcing a seam on his work shirt, darning a hole in a wool sock. These small acts of care were her side of their unspoken conversation. "I am here. I am grateful. I am of use." She found that in caring for his home, she was also caring for herself, rebuilding the shattered pieces of her own identity. She was not just a widow, a victim, a refugee. She was Alara Vance, a woman who knew how to make a home, who could bring warmth and order to a cold room, who could nourish and mend. Her past was a constant, quiet companion. In the long afternoons, as she kneaded bread or stirred a pot, her thoughts would drift back to Thomas. She remembered the day he'd given her the small silver locket she now wore hidden beneath her dress, its surface worn smooth with the touch of her fingers. It held tiny portraits of them, taken on their wedding day. He, so young and serious in his borrowed suit. She, a slip of a girl with hopeful eyes. Jedediah had tried to take it from her, claiming it was a family heirloom. "It was a gift from my husband," she had told him, her voice shaking but firm. It was the only thing of value she had managed to keep, a tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her. The injustice of it all would sometimes rise in her throat like bile, a fresh wave of grief and anger that threatened to overwhelm her. But then she would look at the steady, solid presence of Silas across the room, or feel the satisfying weight of a well-baked loaf of bread in her hands, and the feeling would recede. This place, this strange interlude, was a sanctuary from those feelings. It was a place to simply be. One afternoon, seeking a moment of solitude, she bundled herself in her coat and walked to the barn. The air inside was warm and smelled richly of hay and animals. Her old mare, looking stronger and healthier than she had in years, nickered softly at her approach. As she stroked the horse's velvety nose, she saw Silas at the far end of the barn, working on the shattered wagon wheel. He had brought the entire wagon in, piece by piece, and was now painstakingly repairing it. He had a small forge in the corner, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer on hot metal echoed in the quiet space. He was refitting the iron rim, his movements precise and powerful. He had not told her he was doing this. He was simply fixing what was broken, as was his nature. She watched him, unseen, for a long time. He was a man who spoke through action, whose kindness was not in words, but in a mended wheel, a warm barn for a weary horse, a silent offering of shelter from the storm. In that moment, watching him work, she understood that his quietness was not a lack of feeling, but a different language altogether, one she was slowly, gratefully, beginning to learn. A sudden thaw arrived as unexpectedly as the first storm. For 2 days, a warm wind blew from the south, and the snow began to melt with astonishing speed. The world, which had been a study in white and gray, was suddenly revealed in shades of brown and muddy green. The sound of dripping water was constant, a relentless ticking clock marking the end of their enforced isolation. The roads would soon be passable. The time for her to leave was approaching, a silent, heavy knowledge that settled between them. Alara felt a growing dread, a cold knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. The thought of leaving this small, quiet sanctuary and facing the world alone again was terrifying. Where would she go? What would she do? The future was a blank, intimidating void. This cabin, which had at first been a mere shelter, had become something more. It had become a haven, a place where she had begun to piece herself back together. The thought of climbing back into that mended wagon and driving away felt like another kind of eviction. Silas seemed to feel the change as well. He grew even quieter, if such a thing were possible. A tension hummed in the air between them. He spent more time outdoors, checking fences, clearing pathways, his energy focused on the demands of the changing season. It was as if he were preparing his fortress for her departure, shoring up the walls of his solitude once more. She understood. She was an anomaly, an interruption to his carefully ordered life. He had offered her charity, and the term of that charity was coming to an end. One night, the thaw brought a new crisis. A bitter cold snap followed the warmth, and a driving, freezing rain began to fall. In the middle of the night, Alara was woken by a sound from the barn, a low, distressed moaning. She sat up, her heart pounding. A moment later, she heard Silas moving, pulling on his boots. He lit a lantern, the sudden light making her blink. "One of the cows," he said, his voice tight with concern. "She's calving." Too soon, he didn't have to say that a calf born on a night like this, in these conditions, had little chance of survival. Without thinking, Alara threw her own coat on over her nightdress. "I'm coming with you," she said. He hesitated for only a second, then gave a curt nod. The barn was a maelstrom of sound and shadow. The wind rattled the doors, and the lantern cast huge, dancing shapes against the walls. The cow was lying in the clean straw of a birthing stall, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain and fear. The calf was Breech. Silas cursed under his breath, his face grim in the lantern light. He shed his coat and began to work, his movements swift and sure, speaking to the animal in a low, calming monotone. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline, pushing aside her fear. She remembered nights like this from her youth on her father's farm, the desperate, messy business of bringing life into the world. "I can help," she said, her voice steady. "Hold the lantern high, and bring me those clean sacks." He looked at her, a question in his eyes, but he did what she asked. For the next hour, they worked as a team. He worked to turn the calf, his arms deep inside the laboring mother, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. She held the light steady, her own arm aching with the strain, never letting it waver. She spoke to the cow, her voice the same soothing murmur Thomas had used with frightened animals, a stream of nonsensical, comforting sounds. She brought warm water and cloths, anticipating Silas's needs before he voiced them. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. They moved around each other in the small, hay-strewn space as if they had been doing this for years, a seamless, unspoken partnership born of necessity. Finally, with a great heave from the cow and a final, powerful pull from Silas, the calf was born. It slid out onto the straw, a slick, motionless heap. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. "Come on," Silas breathed, his voice raw. He cleared the calf's airways and began rubbing it vigorously with a rough sack. Alara did the same on the other side, her hands working frantically to stimulate the tiny body. And then, it shuddered. It took a ragged, sputtering breath, and then another. It feebly kicked a leg. It was alive. The mother, exhausted, turned her head and gave her baby a first, tentative lick. Relief washed over Alara so powerfully her knees felt weak. Silas sat back on his heels, breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped. He looked utterly spent. In the golden lantern light, streaked with mud and birthing fluid, he looked at her. The careful mask of stoicism was gone, replaced by a raw, bone-deep weariness and a profound, unguarded gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The two simple words were freighted with more meaning than anything he had ever said to her. They were an acknowledgement not just of her help, but of her competence, her strength. He was not just thanking a guest, he was thanking a partner. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They had saved a life together, in the cold and the dark. Something had shifted between them, something fundamental. The walls of his fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a shared struggle in the straw. The silence that fell between them now was not one of solitude, but of communion. The calf, small but tenacious, survived the night. In the morning, Alara found Silas in the barn, watching as the little creature wobbled on its spindly legs, nudging its mother for milk. A rare, small smile touched the corner of his mouth as he watched. The sight of it made something warm unfurl in Alara's chest. The crisis had passed, but the bond it had forged remained. The tension of her impending departure was still there, but it was different now, layered with a new complexity, a shared memory of struggle and triumph. As the last of the snow melted, revealing the dark, rich earth, Alara felt a powerful, primal urge to dig her hands into the soil. The land around the cabin was untamed, covered in the tough, resilient prairie grasses. But near the south-facing wall, there was a patch of ground that caught the sun for most of the day. An idea took root in her mind, as stubborn and persistent as the calf they had saved. She would plant a garden. It was a foolish, hopeful, defiant act. A garden was an investment in the future, a statement of intent. It was the opposite of being transient. It was an act of putting down roots, even if she knew she would be the one to be uprooted again. She began the work with her bare hands and a sharpened stick, clearing the stubborn turf, her back aching, her palms quickly growing raw. It was punishing work, but she welcomed it. The physical exertion was a release for her pent-up anxiety, a way to channel her fear and uncertainty into something productive, something that created instead of grieved. Each patch of cleared earth was a small victory against the emptiness that awaited her. She was not just clearing a space for seeds. She was clearing a space for hope in her own heart. Silas watched her from a distance. He said nothing as she toiled day after day. She could feel his eyes on her as he went about his own chores, his silent gaze a constant presence. She didn't know what he was thinking. Was he amused by her folly? Annoyed at her presumption? Was he simply waiting for her to tire of the game and announce her departure? His silence was a canvas onto which she projected all her own insecurities. Yet, he did not tell her to stop. One morning, she came out the cabin door to find a set of tools leaning against the wall where she had been working. A spade, a hoe, and a cultivating fork. They were old but well cared for, the wooden handles worn smooth with use, the metal oiled against rust. There was no note, no word of explanation. There didn't need to be. It was another sentence in his silent language. It was permission. It was encouragement. It was, in its own way, a gift. Alara picked up the spade, the handle fitting into her palm as if it were made for her. The weight of it was real, solid. Her foolish project had been acknowledged, validated. A fierce surge of determination went through her. She would make this garden grow. She would create a patch of beauty and sustenance in this wild place. It would be her legacy here, a testament to the time she had spent in this quiet man's sanctuary. It would be something to leave behind. With the proper tools, the work went faster. The rich soil, loamy and dark, smelled of life and possibility. As she worked, she felt a change within herself. The bent posture of grief and fear was slowly straightening. The physical labor was making her stronger, her body leaner and harder. The sun and wind on her face were no longer enemies, but familiar companions. She felt a sense of ownership, not of the land itself, but of her own body, her own effort. Jedediah had taken her home, but he could not take this. He could not take the strength in her hands or the resolve in her heart. She was no longer the broken, desperate creature who had stumbled to this door in a storm. The storm had passed, both outside and in. She was a survivor. And as she prepared the earth for planting, she felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, that she was not just surviving, but preparing to live again. The day was warm, the sky a vast, endless blue. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and new grass. Alara was on her knees in the garden patch, carefully pressing seeds into the furrows she had made, beans, squash, and a few precious carrot seeds she had found in a forgotten corner of Silas's larder. The work was meditative, her mind focused on the simple, hopeful task. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and her heart seized. A rider was approaching, a dark figure on a dark horse, moving with an arrogant purpose across the open land. As he drew closer, the blood drained from her face. She recognized the slump of his shoulders, the confident set of his jaw. It was Jedediah. Fear, cold and sickening, flooded her veins. It was the old fear, the helplessness she had felt as he'd lorded his power over her, his voice dripping with condescending pity while his eyes shone with avarice. What was he doing here? How had he found her? The sanctuary she had so carefully rebuilt in her heart crumbled in an instant. This world, his world of legal papers and cruel whispers, had found her. There was nowhere to run. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron, her body trembling. Silas was at the far end of the property, mending a stretch of fence, his back to the approaching rider. He hadn't seen him yet. Panic clawed at her throat. She wanted to scream his name, to run and hide behind him like a child. But the new, fragile strength she had cultivated over the past weeks held her rooted to the spot. She would not cower. Not this time. Jedediah reined in his horse a few feet from her, kicking up a spray of dirt. He looked down at her from his saddle, a smirk playing on his lips. He took in her plain, worn dress, the dirt on her hands and face, the small, rustic cabin behind her. His eyes glittered with contemptuous amusement. Well, Alara, he said, his voice as unctuous as she remembered. I must say this is a step down. Even for you. I almost didn't recognize you, looking like some field hand. What do you want, Jedediah? She asked, her voice tight but steady. She was proud of the fact that it didn't tremble. What I want? He feigned surprise. Why, I've come for what's mine. You ran off with my mother's silver locket. A precious family heirloom. It was a gift from Thomas, she said through clenched teeth. You know that. A story, he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. A convenient story from a woman who also conveniently can't produce a marriage certificate. The law is quite clear on these matters. You are a thief, and I've come to take back what you stole, and to take you back to town to answer for it. He swung down from his horse, his movements full of self-importance. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. Now give it to me, and we'll go? Don't make this unpleasant. Alara flinched back, her hand flying instinctively to her chest, to the locket hidden beneath her dress. The old terror threatened to paralyze her. His words about the marriage certificate were a poisoned dart. They had lost it in a fire years ago, a fact he knew and was now twisting to his own advantage. He was painting her as a usurper, a common thief, erasing her 40 years with Thomas with a few casual, cruel words. Just then, a quiet voice cut through the air, as calm and solid as the earth itself. That's far enough. Silas. He was standing by the corner of the cabin, his fence-mending tools still in one hand. He hadn't run. He hadn't shouted. He had simply appeared, a silent, immovable object in Jedediah's path. He was not a large man in the way Jedediah was, who was fleshy and soft. Silas was lean, hard, all sinew and bone, but he seemed to take up more space, his presence radiating a kind of grounded authority. His gray eyes were fixed on Jedediah, and they were as cold and flat as river stones. Jedediah turned, startled. He looked Silas up and down with open disdain. And who might you be? He sneered. Her new protector? This is a family matter, friend. It doesn't concern you. You're on my land, Silas said, his voice low, without inflection. And you're upsetting the lady. It concerns me. The lady? Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. This woman is a common thief who's been living off my family's charity for years. I have a writ from the sheriff. Now, stand aside, old man. Before you find yourself in trouble as well. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his size and social standing as a weapon. It was a tactic that had always worked for him. Silas didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. He just watched Jedediah, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was the most unnerving thing Alara had ever seen. Most men would have responded to Jedediah's baiting with anger, with shouting. Silas simply absorbed it, his silence a far more powerful rebuttal than any threat. "I won't ask you again," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower, each word precise and weighted. "Leave my property." Jedediah's face flushed with anger. He was not used to being defied, especially by someone he considered his social and physical inferior. "You think you can stop me?" he blustered, taking another aggressive step forward, intending to push past Silas and grab Alara. In that instant, Silas's quiet demeanor vanished. He didn't move fast, but there was a sudden, lethal focus in his eyes. He dropped the tools, and his hand moved, not toward a weapon, but simply held open at his side. The change was terrifying. The quiet rancher was gone, and in his place was someone else, someone dangerous and absolutely certain. "Try it," Silas whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying the chilling finality of a closing coffin lid. Jedediah froze. He looked into Silas's eyes, and, for the first time, he saw not a simple farmer, but something he could not comprehend and did not want to challenge. All the bluster drained out of him, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at his core. Seeing his hesitation, seeing Silas standing like a bulwark between her and the man who had destroyed her life, Alara felt that new strength surge through her, hot and cleansing. She was not a child to be hidden behind. She was a partner. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Silas, her shoulder almost touching his arm. She looked Jedediah straight in the eye, her own gaze clear and hard. "You are the thief, Jedediah," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "You stole my home. You stole my husband's memory. You will not have this. You will not have me." She raised her chin. "Now do as he says, and leave." Her voice, her presence beside him, seemed to solidify Silas's resolve even further. They stood together, a united front. Two quiet people who had been underestimated, who had found a common strength. Jedediah looked from one to the other, at their shared certainty, their absolute refusal to be cowed. He was beaten. He knew it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no more threats to make, no more authority to claim. He had lost. With a final, venomous glare, Jedediah backed away. He stumbled backward like a man who had walked into a wall he hadn't seen. He turned, practically scrambling back to his horse, his arrogance shattered. He hauled himself into the saddle, his movements clumsy and graceless. "You'll regret this," he spat, the words empty and pathetic. "Both of you." He yanked hard on the reins, turning the horse so sharply it whinnied in protest, and galloped away, a graceless retreat across the prairie. They stood together, Silas and Alara, watching until he was just a small, dark speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The threat was gone. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the new grass and the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her trembling, not with fear, but with the aftermath of a battle hard won. She looked at Silas, at his strong, quiet profile. He had not defended her as a knight defends a helpless maiden. He had stood with her, creating a space for her to find her own voice, to fight her own battle. He had protected her, yes, but he had also trusted in her strength. He turned his head and looked down at her. His gray eyes were no longer cold. They were warm, filled with a quiet respect that was more precious to her than any declaration. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a widow, not as a victim, but as the woman who had stood beside him and faced down her demon. A slow, unfamiliar feeling spread through her chest, a feeling of profound gratitude, of loyalty, of a connection so deep it needed no words. He had given her shelter from the storm, and now he had given her sanctuary from the world. This quiet, solitary man had become her anchor. She had arrived here with nothing, and now, she realized with a startling clarity, she possessed something of infinite value. She had found a home, not in the wood and stone of the cabin, but in the steadfast, unspoken solidarity of the man who stood beside her. He reached down, his calloused hand briefly, gently, covering hers where it rested on the garden spade. The touch was light, fleeting, but it was an affirmation. A promise. You are not alone. And in the vast, quiet prairie, under the endless sky, she knew it was true. In the days that followed the confrontation, a new kind of peace settled over the small ranch. The violent intrusion of the outside world had served only to solidify the quiet bond between them. Jedediah's threats had been the final storm, and they had weathered it together. Now, the silence that fell between them in the evenings was no longer just comfortable. It was companionable. It was the easy quiet of two people who understood each other on a level that transcended speech. They had been tested and had not been found wanting. Alara threw herself into the garden with a renewed vigor. It was no longer just an act of hope, but a declaration of permanence. She was tending her own soil now. The work settled her, the rhythm of planting and weeding and watering a daily affirmation of life's persistence. The first green shoots that pushed their way through the dark earth felt like a personal triumph. She would call Silas over to inspect a new sprout with a seriousness that made the corner of his mouth twitch in that rare, small smile of his. He would nod gravely, his gray eyes appraising the tiny plant as if it were a prize bull. These small, shared moments were the bedrock of their new reality. He, in turn, began to share his world with her in subtle ways. He showed her how he could tell the weather by the clouds on the horizon, how to track a deer by a barely perceptible scuff in the dirt. He taught her the names of the prairie birds whose songs filled the morning air. He never presented it as a lesson, but simply spoke his thoughts aloud as they worked near each other, offering her pieces of his knowledge, of himself. One afternoon, he brought a chair out of the cabin and set it by her garden patch, and simply sat, oiling a bridle, while she worked. His presence was a quiet comfort, a silent statement that her work, her presence, was a valued part of his landscape. Her transformation was profound. The haunted, fearful look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, steady gaze. Her hands, though calloused and stained with dirt, moved with a new confidence. Her back was straight, her shoulders no longer bowed by the weight of grief. She had found her footing on this small patch of earth. She had not simply been given shelter, she had helped to build a home. She realized that the strength Thomas had always seen in her had not been extinguished, only buried beneath layers of loss and despair. Silas had given her the time and the safety to unearth it again. One evening, after a simple supper of rabbit stew and the first tender lettuces from her garden, they sat on the small porch, watching the sun set. The sky was awash in fiery colors, streaks of orange and purple painting the clouds. It was a spectacular, breathtaking sight, and they watched it in their usual comfortable silence. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. Alara felt a sense of peace, so deep it felt as if it had settled into her very bones. She had stopped thinking about the future, about where she would go. The question no longer seemed relevant. Silas finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the horizon, at the vast expanse of land that was his life. "My father built this place," he said. It was the first time he had ever volunteered a piece of his personal history. Alara remained silent, knowing this was a rare offering, a glimpse behind the wall of his solitude. "He and my mother. They came from back east. Carved it right out of the prairie." He paused, and she could hear the echo of a long-held grief in his voice. "They died of the fever in the same week. I was 16-inch. The simple, unadorned facts hit her with the force of a physical blow. A boy of 16, left alone in this vast, empty land to fend for himself. She suddenly understood the depth of his solitude, the reason for the fortress he had built. It wasn't a choice born of misanthropy, but a necessity forged in loss. He had learned to rely only on himself because he'd had no one else. His silence wasn't a rejection of the world, but a shield against its capacity to wound, to take everything away in an instant. Her heart ached for that lonely boy, and for the solitary man he had become. "I'm sorry, Silas," she whispered. He gave a small, barely perceptible shrug, as if to dismiss the weight of his own history. But he continued speaking, his gaze still fixed on the fading light. "People in town, they always thought I was strange. The boy who stayed, the man who never left. They don't understand this place. They see emptiness. I see everything." He finally turned his head and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the entirety of his world, the harshness and the beauty, the solitude and the peace. "You see it too," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. In that moment, she knew she loved him. It was not the passionate, youthful love she had shared with Thomas. This was something quieter, deeper, forged in a crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. It was a love that saw the scars and the strengths, that honored the silences as much as the spoken words. It was a partnership of two resilient souls who had found in each other a safe harbor. He turned his gaze back to the land, now draped in the soft, deep blue of twilight. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "The soil is good here," he said, his voice quiet, almost casual. But the words hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. He wasn't just talking about her garden. He was talking about a life. He was talking about the future. It was not a proposal, not a declaration, but an observation, an invitation, an offering of a place to put down roots, permanently. Alara looked from his strong, weathered profile to the small, sturdy cabin, its window glowing with the warm light of the lamp she had lit. She looked at the thriving patch of green that was her garden, a testament to her own resilience. She thought of the long, lonely road that had brought her here, the storm that had almost claimed her. It had not been an end, but a beginning. A difficult, painful, necessary journey to this exact spot, to this exact moment. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first truly joyful smile she had felt in a very long time. It felt like a sunrise inside her. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but sure, filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "It is."